How housing as an asset is driving inequality in South Africa. Looking at the housing crisis in our country. So, before I start, I want to be clear about something. The ideas in this video were inspired by an argument made by Gary's Economics in one of his videos titled The Real Reason Behind the Housing Crisis. He looks at housing as a global issue rather than a local problem. And that framing really caught my attention. But in this video, we are not going to talk about the UK, Europe, or America. This video is about housing in South Africa, right? So I wrote down some notes on the points that I want us to cover, because when you take that global idea and bring it home, it actually explains a lot of what we are seeing as a country. From the skyrocketing property prices in Cape Town and Sandton, to the growth of informal settlements, to why so many young professionals feel permanently locked out of the property market, right? So the goal of this video is simple. We want to take that global insight and apply it to the South African context, right? So once you start looking at housing this way, the conversation changes. It stops being about individual cities or short-term fixes, and it starts being about how our entire economic system treats housing as an asset first and shelter second, right? And that's where the real problem begins. Because the real reason behind the housing crisis in South Africa, it is a global phenomenon, not just a local issue. When people talk about the housing crisis in South Africa, the conversation usually goes in predictable directions. We usually blame corruption, government failure, immigration, banks being greedy, or developers building luxury apartments that the average South African cannot afford, right? But while some of these things matter, they don't actually explain the full picture, because the problems are not quite unique to South Africa. It is something that's happening everywhere, right? Across the globe, from London, New York, Toronto, Sydney, Amsterdam, and including our very own Cape Town. So these issues are across the board. They are across different governments, different policies, and different populations. But the outcome is the same. Housing is becoming unaffordable everywhere. And that's the first clue that we are not dealing with a local housing problem. We are dealing with a global asset affordability crisis. And housing or property just happens to be the asset class that ordinary people feel strongly about. Because in our constitution, housing is a basic human right. So a lot of people don't look at housing as an investment asset, because buying a home is quite personal for a lot of people. Unlike investing in the stock market, you can live a decent life without owning any company shares, but the same cannot be said with not owning a house. But for the rich or wealthy people, these are just assets. Both the shares and property, they are just investment assets. So trying to answer why housing feels so expensive, we need to start with a basic question. Why does housing feel so expensive right now? If you earn a decent salary in South Africa, let us say you are a young professional earning somewhere between 25 and 40,000 rands a month, on paper and considering the level of unemployment in our country, that kind of salary is not poverty. But try buying a house in Cape Town southern suburbs, Sandton, Rosebank, Umhlanga, or even parts of Pretoria East, and then suddenly you are priced out almost immediately. Probably even your parents, earning less than you in terms of salary, are owning a much better house than what you can afford. A two-bedroom apartment that was sold for 900,000 10 or 15 years ago now goes for around 2.5 million or more, right? And that price increase didn't happen because that apartment magically doubled in quality or that it was completely renovated. It happened because housing stopped being treated primarily as shelter and became treated as an investment asset. So once housing becomes an asset, it starts behaving like any other asset. And assets don't care about your salary, they only care about how much money is chasing them, right? So a key insight from Gary's economics is that if housing prices are rising everywhere, not just locally, then the cause of price increase must be a global factor and not just a local influence. And the key observation is that when you zoom out, you see something interesting. It is not just housing that's becoming expensive. Land prices are up, shares are up, gold as an asset is up, art as an asset is up. So all long-term assets across the board have increased dramatically in price. So housing is not that special as an asset. It's just part of a wider situation where assets are becoming unaffordable relative to wages. And in South Africa, wages have barely kept up with inflation for most people, while on the other hand, asset prices, especially property, have increased in desirable locations. So that gap or mismatch is the crisis. So we also need to understand what's driving all of this. The answer is quite simple. When wealthy people get more money, they don't spend it the same way ordinary people do. They don't just double their grocery budget or buy 10 cars that they won't drive. They buy real assets. And assets are limited, right? Because there's only so much land in good locations, there's only so many beachfront properties, and there's only so many well-located apartments that are near jobs, schools, or transport. So when more money chases the same fixed pool of assets, the prices for those assets will naturally increase. It is the basic theory of demand and supply. And in South Africa, the effects of this are amplified by inequality. A small group of people earn extremely well, sometimes in dollars or euros, sometimes through business ownership and other investments. And most of that money doesn't just sit in cash, it flows into property as an investment asset. So even when unemployment is high and the economic growth is weak, asset prices can keep rising, right? That is why we can have a struggling economy and a booming property market at the same time. And then you also need to ask yourself, who are you really competing with? Or who are you really competing against? One of the most frustrating parts of this crisis is that ordinary buyers don't realize who they are competing against. You may think you are competing against another young couple who's your age, but in reality, you are competing against property investors, developers, pension funds, high net worth individuals, and sometimes even foreign buyers who are using South African property as a hedge or some holiday investment. In Cape Town, this is especially visible. People earning normal South African salaries are competing with buyers whose income comes from overseas or whose wealth comes from assets rather than salaries. So the playing field is not that level. Housing is one of the major assets that ordinary people used to be able to own, and this dynamic exists globally. But South Africa's inequality makes it much worse. If you already own property, rising prices make you wealthier on paper without you doing anything, right? But if you don't own any property, rising prices push you further away from owning property every single year. So that's how inequality compounds. Wealth creates more wealth, and lack of wealth becomes harder to escape as time goes, because as time goes, asset prices are increasing. And if you are not increasing in wealth, you are being pushed away from owning assets. And in a country like South Africa, where apartheid already distorted land ownership and access to housing, this asset-driven system doesn't just preserve inequality, but it makes it worse. Now, another point we need to talk about is how this plays out in real life. Usually, young people delay buying homes and opt to buy cars first, and many of them stay with their parents into their 30s. Others rent indefinitely, often spending a large portion of their income on rent and car installments. leaving them with little cash of building equity, right? Most of us are guilty of this, right? But then that's just how things are, right? And then when they are ready to buy property, they tend to move further away from city centers to affordable housing, which in turn increases commuting time and transport cost. And that affects family life, mental health, productivity, and even safety. At the lower end of the income spectrum, the effects are very devastating. When formal housing becomes unaffordable, informal settlements tend to grow. Slums don't expand because people prefer to stay in slums. They expand because the asset market excludes people faster than wages can catch up. So the housing crisis becomes a transport crisis, a health crisis, an education crisis, and eventually a social stability crisis, right? And people often ask, why are developers always building for the rich? The answer is uncomfortable, but it is very logical. Developers respond to where the money is, and the money is concentrated at the top. If a developer can sell 10 units to wealthy buyers at a high margin instead of 100 affordable units at low margin, then the incentive is very clear. This is how the system rewards capital. In places like Cape Town and Johannesburg's northern suburbs, new developments are increasingly targeted at the upper middle class and wealthy buyers, not because demand doesn't exist elsewhere, but because purchasing power exists in these areas, right? So the winners are the people who are already owning property, property investors, developers, and anyone whose wealth is tied to asset appreciation. The losers, on the other hand, are the first-time buyers, renters, young people, and workers whose income comes mainly from their salaries. And the key point is that if you are losing, it is not because you are lazy, irresponsible, or that you are bad with your money. It is because you are operating in a system that rewards asset ownership far more than labor, right? And if you don't make any effort to own any assets, then the unfortunate part is that you will stay a loser. That's just how the system is, right? So blaming immigration is emotionally satisfying, but economically, that is weak. Cities with declining populations still face rising asset prices. Countries with strict immigration controls face the same crisis. So immigration can affect demand at the margins, but it does not explain a global asset boom, right? And in South Africa, focusing mainly on immigration distracts you from the real issue and fuels social tensions without fixing asset affordability. So the key takeaway from this video is that housing prices increase because housing is an investment asset more than it is a shelter. So since the rich keep getting richer, that means houses will not stop becoming unaffordable anytime soon, because the rich usually park most of their money in investment assets, and housing is just one of them, right? My name is Siyabonga Mokwena. Thanks for watching until the end. Don't forget to subscribe for more.